everybody, what is going on? I am Maximus Rex, and this is Big Baby Reviews. Today is Wildcard Sunday, where we look at things a little bit different from the regularly scheduled videos during the week. And today we're looking at Star Slammers, the Marvel graphic novel from the early 80s, 1983 to be more specific, by Walter Simonson. A little bit of backstory to this. A little bit of backstory to my comic collecting days as a kid. So I discovered this when I lived in North Bay, Ontario, right? My dad was in the army. Before that, I lived in Victoria. And by the time we moved from Victoria to North Bay, I'd been collecting comics for about a year, I guess I would say. Starting in around X-Force 1 and 2, all the way to the early Image stuff, Spawn 1 and 2, I remember kind of getting when I was there. And then boof, moved more than halfway across the country to North Bay, Ontario, where I lived from when I was 11 to 14. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that if I can remember the name, there were two comic shops in North Bay. One was called DNA Comics, and the other one was called Dark Horse Comics. I'd gone to both, and I kind of preferred the vibe at DNA Comics. It was an older gentleman. His name was Dave. Forget his wife's name, but it was something like Agnes, right? So that's why it was called DNA. And that's where a lot of my early collector memories are from that shop, and getting my comics there and my Image comics and waiting for Youngblood #4 forever and buying The Death of Superman, right? That all happened to DNA Comics. And then one day, poof, DNA Comics disappeared, and it was the internet. There was no internet back then, so I had no idea what had happened. It just closed shop, and basically, there was only one comic book shop left, and that was Dark Horse Comics, so I had to start going there. They were the snootier kind of comic book shop, but whatever, I still, for at least, I guess, the last year and a half of living in North Bay until when I was 14, we moved then to Ottawa, or Hull. So getting my comics at Dark Horse Comics. So at some point, fairly close to when I moved away from North Bay, there was some sort of flea market in the northern part of town. So we, my parents, I guess on a weekend or something, decided to go there. And lo and behold, who do I find but good old Dave, right? He'd closed down the comic shop, but now, he was an older gentleman. He would come and bring comics to the flea market and sell them there. So great. And one of the purchases I made, I remember buying a few things because a lot of stuff I was a lot cheaper than when they were in the comic book store. You can deal with them and stuff, deal them down, especially in the flea market setting. But one of the books that caught my eye, and I don't exactly remember how much it wasn't too expensive, but was this Star Slammers book by Walter Simonson. Again, back then, no internet, so I didn't even know this thing existed, right? I'd never really heard, I may have heard a few references to it, and that was about it. So it was kind of like, finding something pretty rare. So I picked it up, and pretty happy that I did. And as you can tell from the cover here, this book has followed me since then. That's 30 years now, because I'm 44. And plus, at that point, the book was already like 12 years old. So a little worse for the wear, but still very readable. You can see there's kind of a, I don't know if the sun bleached this section a little bit, but there's a darker section at the top here. Hopefully that picks up on the camera. It's a very weathered comic, weathered in red. Some of the blue here has faded away or brushed off in the sky's coloring. There's a little bit of a water stain down here. So it's got a lot of character, which sometimes I like, especially for these older comics. Anything from the early 80s, 90s, it's like you kind of want them to be slick for some reason because the aesthetic and everything. But when you find stuff in the 70s and 80s that still kind of look like this, slightly weathered and stuff, I kind of enjoy it. So, well, let's stop talking about that and let's start talking about Star Slammers. Great cover, right? So my general comment about this, let's talk about Walter Simonson for a bit. He's often credited as kind of, again, some of these pages are starting to go. Commonly credited as kind of a guy who worked in a lot of Kirby into his artwork. But what I'm seeing, and what I, even as a kid, what I felt because I'd been exposed to European comics, is that European comics influence. When he does Thor in the 80s, he's still got a bit of it, but he's clearly doing more of a Jack Kirby kind of thing. But with this here, I think you see both the American and especially the European influence on his art. It's almost like he's mixing, Druyet, Moebius, and Jack Kirby and New Gods, for example, right? That kind of vibe. Almost like, if a European had done New Gods, what would it look like? And that's kind of the vibe I get with Star Slammers and their costume designs. And just all throughout the aesthetic and the hatching, the coloring, just to me screams, European comics. Even the lettering, not the lettering, excuse me, but the layouts and the panels and stuff. Definitely kind of slightly more widescreen than what we were seeing in typical kind of Marvel DC comics. He's doing a lot of the vertical panel, which is going to become kind of a Image 90s staple. And you got to assume with this kind of story and sci-fi kind of fantasy epic, he's mixing in some of his New Gods influences, but also, I'm sure by this point, 1983, Star Wars, probably some Dune stuff. I'm sure Walter Simonson is aware of Dune, and phallic-shaped starships. That's kind of a staple now all throughout sci-fi. But yeah, it seems like he's channeling a lot of that stuff. There's even like, we didn't hear about Jodorowsky's Dune for years, until the documentary probably came out about 10 years ago. But, the artists and the guys working, within the medium and within the industry, I'm sure had heard about it. So I get a slight vibe of some Jodorowsky kind of looks and concepts in here, a little bit of surrealism thrown in. But yeah, Star Slammers, basically they're kind of intergalactic bounty hunters. And, basically they're saving up money to be able to attack the kind of emperor fellow who attacked them and killed their parents as they were kids. There's a scene in here that's very reminiscent of New Gods. I think the episode or the issue is The Pact, right? Where you see a bit of the history of Highfather. We're going to see that here. And I mean, if the Luke Skywalker influence isn't obvious here, I mean, come on. You've got the Yoda type character, the kind of force, right? There's a power in here. I forget if it's called the mind meld or something like that, but basically they can all kind of mentally join together and fight as one, which we're going to see near the end. I don't want to give away too much about the story if you want to read this. Got to praise the coloring too. The coloring, again, to me is just not American at all. It's very European and European of that 70s, 80s period, and I think that's great. I love the color choices here. And yeah, so they're basically coming in and hunting the inhabitants of this planet here, right? And that's, I think, like I said, it's almost pretty much the story from the Pact and the New Gods, or very similar to it anyways. This concept of humans being hunted by, in this case, richer or more highborn characters, right? And that's where the Star Slammers get their motivation from. And again, I'm going to talk about the colors because, like, from scene to scene, right, we move into like purples and magentas here, and they really work. Like, it's not quite monochrome, but it's pretty darn close. This is pretty darn close to monochrome as well. You got some reds, some oranges, some yellows, but we're definitely staying warm colors, cool colors, right? Well, I say here we've got cool and warm. But yeah, all throughout the scene, colors are consistent, and it's so important. Simonson doing some interesting kind of layout things here. One image becomes two, right? Kind of shift the focus. Slow us down a little bit when we're reading it. I mean, nothing needs to be said about Walt Simonson's art, but there's something I appreciate about kind of this early 80s version of Walt Simonson. I know he's done some Star Wars comics. He did the Alien comic book adaptation a few years earlier. So the comic looks of that period, but of very high quality comics of that period. Again, the European production values, right? That American comics just didn't really have very often around that time. But yeah, I don't want to sell you too much on the story because it's just a beautiful book that I think you can get immersed in when you start reading it. I sure did when I was 14 years old. And really the idea here specifically with this is I think it's something you should seek out because I think it's pretty easy to find. It's not too expensive. And it's just a great one-shot, again, sci-fi fantasy adventure story with great visuals that kind of bridge the gap between America and Europe at that time. A few pages I feel sometimes in the production, just the printing, are just end up being a little bit blurry, but it kind of adds to, again, that vintage production value sense. Great vertical panels, you gotta think that probably the Image guys were looking at some Walt Simonson, right? Eric Larson for sure. But I mean, I'm wondering if this vertical panel, I don't think necessarily Walt Simonson invented that, but he certainly uses it a lot. And then we know the Image guys will really use it a lot. Some great depictions of action, quiet scenes, every once in a while tilting the horizon. I love that, right? Just to give it a little bit more dynamics. again, with Simonson, he's a master storyteller, so there's no hiccups when you're reading this, you know exactly what's going on. The reading sense is obvious. And again, the layouts are just, yeah, very, very, to me, Star Wars influenced in their visuals, right? But these points of view, I love, like, you're one of the ships within that shot, I think are great. And you'll see, like, the multiplication of panels here of them using the mind meld or the force or whatever the hell you want to call it, right? It's starting here, and they're trying to connect, right, their minds, but like that white panel is just indicating it's not working, right? And our hero, of course, in this case, because it's a one-shot, he can die. So he's the one who figures out that, you know, to create that mind meld, you're going to have to be kind of at the threshold of death. Okay, not everyone necessarily, but he is. And that's how they get to the point where, you know, they actually meld their minds together, right? And I love the depiction of it here, how they did it, because it's obviously one big image, but split into so many smaller panels. And I imagine this was drawn as one image and there was an overlay on top to create this, because just creating these panels would have sucked really as an artist. So there's easier ways of doing that. And then all these little extra panels that are inserted. Recently I did a Savage Dragon review where Eric Larson uses a lot of these little kind of panels in a bigger panel to show that it's a big crowd. So he doesn't have to actually draw the crowd, or you can do the crowd in silhouette and keep it simple. But then the fact that you've got these multiple heads indicates that there's a lot of people there, which is what we're seeing here. I've always loved this page. I think it's a beautiful visualization of the concept of the mind meld out in space. And he kind of keeps that pattern up right throughout the action where, you know, big panels are like just clever design, amazing design actually, right? Where like what the implication is that, you know, this is other panels continuing on outside. So it gives you a sense that this moves out, right, from beyond the confines of the page here, even though it literally doesn't, right? Every panel is left open wherever it can be. This one here, right, just by like a third or a half panel, you know, that indicates that the panels continue on and on. Very clever. There's more of it here. And really all it is just one big kind of splash image with a few insert panels here. But like all his machinery, all his mechanics are sound. The texturing of them, the shading. And you still get a sense that he's working pretty fast. So it's very energetic, you know, it kind of moves and jumps off the page. There's a good use of no border. Yeah, it just pulls out all the kind of tricks and makes it seamless. What a great establishing shot, right? Again, McFarlane uses that a lot for the establishing shot, the vertical panel. Simonson doing it here with the mountains. Very cool. And there we go. Don't want to bore you too much with the details. We got another one last awesome POV kind of splash of spaceships going towards some sort of, you know, time warp or tunnel, whatever it is, on to the next adventure. And I'm aware that Star Slimers had a series in the 90s with Bravura. I've never really checked it out. It looks a little bit different, so I don't know for sure if it follows the storyline or if it's kind of a new take on it. But, you know, maybe, I think I've seen them in dollar bins before, so maybe next time I see them, I should pick them up and find out. And there you've got their tagline, right? Once upon a time, there was a race of men who could outshoot, outfight, and outkill anybody. They were paid fabulous sums to act as mercenaries. The practice became so lucrative, they decided to go into business. They became the most successful businessmen in history, and they call themselves the Star Slimers. So there you go. Recommended reading, just as a great one-shot graphic novel. Great art, great vibes. Late 70s, early 80s kind of deal, you know. If you're into He-Man, if you're into Star Wars, if you're into Dune, those kinds of things, Druyet, European art, you're going to really love early 80s Star Slimers Marvel graphic novel by Walter Simonson. So there you go, guys. If you're still watching and you're subscribed, thank you so much. I really appreciate you still being there. If you're watching but you're not subscribed, please do so below. It takes only about a second for you. It really helps our channel grow, helps get us out there to more people and other people who are into comic books just like we are. So thank you again so much for watching. Have an awesome day.
Like, subscribe, like, subscribe.
King Comics presents Big Baby, Volume 1, Issues 1 to 13, 204 pages of story and art. King Comics also presents Star Crasher One Shot, 32 pages, cosmic sci-fi surrealist adventure. You can find these fine comics at KingComics.CA, at MaximusRex13 on Instagram, or on Facebook, MaxRex or Big Baby.